guys, G-Economics here. How remiss of me not to have done a video on figure 5.1, so here we go. Figure 5.1 is all about aggregate demand, as you know, and you'll know that the AD equation is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, net exports. You know that added together, all of that should give you a value of 100%. In the table, figure 5.1, here we have all of those components outlined for us. So we have our investment, gross capital formation. We have our C element, which is the consumption, and we can also then include here, we've got the public element of expenditure, so the G component. We've got the external sector, which is your net exports, the X minus M. So all of these components, and indeed the bold numbers in this table, should add together to give a value of 100%. You can see 97.3 plus 18.9, that gives you a value of 116.2. And then we have this minus number to take off that for the net exports, and that brings us back to a value of 100%. So what can we say about the percentage of GDP for 2001? Well, clearly, first of all, consumption, 97.3%. So we have an economy which is very imbalanced. C being the major driver of AD in this instance. So you need to think of this in terms of it's consumption-led, and it may even be consumption-led, debt-fueled expansion and shifting of AD in this instance. The breakdown between the public element of expenditure and the private element of expenditure is very significant and very important here. So the private element, 87.2%. So in terms of the overall spend on consumption, private consumption by households is very, very significant and the key driver here. Now that could be indicative of an economy which is consuming beyond its means. What about the external sector? Well, the external sector, we can see it's a minus number. So this is indicative again of a trade deficit position. And again, this would also indicate to us that this is an economy consuming beyond its domestic needs and its domestic means, because its domestic production capacity is not able to meet the demands within the economy, and so imports are being sucked in from abroad. And we see that here with the fact that we have the minus on the imports, the plus on the exports, but overall it's in a trade deficit position. Now don't forget, an economy which is importing a lot, particularly an economy like Zambia, there'll be a few issues there with regard to, number one, depletion of foreign exchange reserves, and we already know about the foreign exchange constraint and how problematic this can be for a developing nation such as Zambia. You'll know that when an economy is importing more than it's exporting, the supply of the currency, so the supply of the kwacha in this instance, will be increasing. And as a consequence of that, that will be putting downward pressure onto the kwacha, raising the price of imports, and again, making it difficult for an economy like Zambia to bring in those essential imports which are necessary for its development. So, very important points with regard to the fact that this is a minus number. And then with regard to investment, very important to note that public sector investment is greater than private sector. And don't forget about the drawbacks of public sector investment. Public sector investment, particularly in developing nations, tends to go on prestige projects which won't actually contribute to the long-run aggregate supply, to the productive capacity of the economy. They might build enormous statues and large diplomatic buildings and so on, but it's not going to benefit the general population. Also, don't forget, public sector investment tends to be highly X-inefficient, a term that I've discussed before, whereas private sector investment tends to be much more X-efficient, and you would want certainly much more private sector investment than public sector. And a final point on that, don't forget that public sector investment tends to quote-unquote crowd out private sector investment. So that's the situation in 2001, and so it's painting a picture of an economy where AD is rising faster than AS, There's a trade-off clearly between rising AD, rising output, and the trade-off being that obviously that will generate inflation. And don't forget to look to the paragraphs above where it talks about the fact that whilst inflation is falling, it's still in the region of 6%, so it's still very high. We move on then a number of years to 2009, and we can see changes and progress being made here actually. So let's look at the consumption figures. So consumption falling then from 97.3% to 76.3%. So clearly strides being taken and strides being made, particularly with regard to the private element of consumption, which falls from 87.2% to 57%. Now that should help to bring into balance that external sector number, because the demand for imported goods potentially is going to be falling, and we do see that, don't we, in this figure. We now move from a minus to a positive, so we've got trade surplus position. But of course, don't forget that sort of 2008, 2009, 2010 and so on, that will be the time when there has been a very significant boom in the copper industry, and the booming exports of copper will of course have helped to move this into surplus. The booming copper prices of course will also be very good for Zambia's foreign exchange position, which in turn makes it easier to bring in imports, and the increased demand for those exports of copper will increase the demand for the kwacha, puts the price of the kwacha up, the exchange rate of the kwacha rises, and of course that then makes it cheaper to bring in imports. So those elements combined make it easier for the Zambian economy to bring in the capital goods which are necessary for development. And then finally, with regard to investment, we see a significant movement into private sector investment. Tremendous in terms of efficiency and improving the long-run aggregate supply. Let's have private sector investment which is going to be into things which are going to benefit not only the nation but the residents of the nation as well. So this is from 2001 to 2009, to 2009, we're seeing an improving picture, because we're moving from a situation in 2001 where AD was going to be banging up against the capacity of AS. Now AS and AD should be moving in tandem. And don't forget about the fact that investment is triple powered in that respect, because it boosts AD, it boosts AS, and it provides an overall quality improvement to the goods and services that the economy is producing. So that's 01 to 09, an improving picture. Then we looked at 10, 11 and 12, and we looked to see what's happening in these years and whether or not that improvement is continuing. Now obviously, given the data in figure 5.2, we know that the position is not improving. But let's have a look at the figures and just see why we don't have an improving position. So, with regard to gross capital formation percentage changes, so first of all we can see a decline in the amount of investment. Now, and we should be careful what we're saying here, shouldn't we? We see a decline in the percentage increases per annum. So whilst investment is still going up, it's going up by a smaller percentage, 6.5% instead of 14.7%. So again, in terms of productive capacity, productive potential, position of your long-run aggregate supply curve, position of your PPC, that's not a good thing. We see a move away from private sector investment back towards being dominated by public sector, and we know all the issues surrounding that. And indeed, this public sector investment, whilst it's 25% increase, it only, if we fast forward here, it only contributes 1.5% to the overall growth of the Zambian economy. So one must ask oneself, where is all of this additional investment money going to? And one might say this is clearly indicative of corruption in the Zambian economy. Significant increase, but doesn't really have a big long-run economic impact in the economy. We can see here we've got a minus figure. So in 2011, in terms of private sector investment, it did actually fall in that year. So machinery which was wearing out wasn't replaced, and so in terms of the private sector capacity, it's fallen in 2011. And so we can talk about here the crowding out effect of public sector investments and the whole X inefficiency argument with public sector investment. What about consumption? Well, again, we can see that in terms of increases, again, it's the private elements which are going up. So the household spending, it's switching back to the economy being reliant on household expenditure here. And then finally, moving into the exports and imports, again, we can see that the percentage increases, so the volumes are, generally speaking, higher for imports than exports. And again, indicative of an economy living beyond its means, sucking in too many imports, and potentially not having the capacity in its own economy to meet the needs and demands in its own economy. And the other thing which we must mention here, with regard to this data, 15.05, 1.8, is of course the Dutch disease. Don't forget to mention the Dutch disease. I've mentioned this in previous videos, where economies which are heavily reliant on a commodity for export and growth of the economy, everything goes into that. Just all the investment in the economy goes into that particular area, which of course in the good times is great. But whenever we hit the buffers and the demand for that particular commodity stops, you've got, because your economy is not diversified in any way, and you've got no investment going in other areas, then you become unstuck. And then finally, we look to the percentage contributions to real GDP growth. So we can see these are impressive growth figures, certainly 6.6%, 6.5%, 6.7%. Certainly impressive. And we can see here that the various contributions to these levels of growth. You obviously want to point out, first of all, that what do you want to point out first of all? Well, first of all, consumption, 6.8% a 6.8% contribution to an overall growth rate of 6.6, 6.0 to 6.5, and then 6.6 to 6.7. So consumption again being the key driver of growth in this economy. With regard to investment, we've already talked about the fact that this goes up significantly but doesn't contribute much, and the whole issue of monies being siphoned off and backhanders being given to diplomats and all of that type of thing, the whole corruption aspect. So the investment element not really making a significant impact into the real GDP growth rates. And then again, with regard to the external sector, it continues to be a drag on growth. So the net exports, the fact that it's negative, continues to be a drag on growth. Now, of course, some might say that the fact that it's a bit of a drag on growth, that would help obviously to prevent AD ramming up against the constraints of the AS curve and contributing to increased levels of inflation. And the other thing to note, obviously, with regard to these points is that although these are very significant, during this time, Zambia is experiencing very, very rapid rates of population growth. And so although this is very significant, if you were to have another row on here, which was real GDP per capita, it might not be quite as impressive. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a picture of an improving situation from 01 to 09, but then reverting to type in 2010, 2011, 2012. And that's it, I'll leave it at that. Any questions, get in touch.